Last year, I decided to take a road trip to visit two of my high school friends. They had moved to Linz, Austria, where they were studying at the University of Vienna. And since then, I have been visiting them every summer to spend time with them. We spent long days together in high school, and we became like brothers, and I couldn't miss these annual visits. I usually flew there, but last year I decided to drive instead of fly, because I wanted to discover the different places along the way, from nature parks to historical museums, and all those sites I had always wanted to visit. I left early in the day so that I could visit all those places that were on the road. I knew that the trip would take several days, and my goal was to make the most of every moment on the road. The first few days of the trip went smoothly and without any major problems. But on the third day, when I expected to arrive at my destination in the evening, I was surprised to find that I was still halfway there and in the dark. It was about 9 or 10 p.m., and the road was very quiet, to the point of hardly any traffic. This was comforting on one hand, but on the other hand, it made me feel a bit nervous. Deserted roads always made me feel a bit anxious, especially at this time of night. I still had several hours to get to my final destination, but I was looking forward to it, and I wanted to get there as quickly as possible. However, I also needed to stop and rest a little. My body needed a break after hours of continuous driving. I decided to stop at the nearest rest stop on the road. This stop was very small compared to the big gas stations or truck stops. It was just a small building with a row of parking spaces in front of it. I didn't need much more at that moment. I arrived at the stop and found it completely dark, and there was no one else there. I pulled up next to the building and got out of my car. The wind was a little chilly at the moment, so I took the time to walk to get some of the lethargy out of my body. It was a relief to stretch out after hours of driving, so I stopped to stretch my legs and arms a bit before heading into the building. As I entered, I noticed that the place was very quiet. There was a narrow hallway leading to a closet, and on one side was a men's restroom, and on the other side was a women's restroom. There were also some vending machines along the walls. I stopped at one of the machines and started looking for an energy drink to help me keep going. While I was looking at the machine, I noticed another car had pulled into the station and parked right next to mine. There were plenty of other parking spots, so I found this a little strange. Why would someone park right next to mine? I didn't want to make a fuss about it, so I decided to ignore him and go to the bathroom. I did what I had to do and came out about 5 minutes later. As I got out, I noticed that the car was still parked next to mine with the lights on. It looked like the driver was still inside the car, which made me wonder what he was doing, but I didn't think it was anything to worry about at the time. I took my drink from the vending machine and started drinking it. With every sip, I couldn't stop thinking about the car next to me. There was something uncomfortable about the car being there, and I felt like I couldn't leave it without watching what was happening. I didn't know why this situation was bothering me so much, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Moments later, as I was about to leave, I heard the car's engine turn off. A second later, the driver's door opened and a tall, bearded man, wearing a brown leather jacket, stepped out with his hands in his pockets. I stopped in my tracks near the door and felt something strange. The man was walking slowly towards me, and his eyes were fixed on me in a way that made me feel very tense. I suddenly felt very uncomfortable, but I tried to remain calm, even though my heart was beating very fast. I watched his steps anxiously, and there was only a small distance between us. When he approached me, I tried to appear calm, but I felt a chill in my body when I saw his smile. It was a strange, suspicious smile, and it made me even more tense. We passed each other, and I nodded in greeting. The man gestured at me in the same way. Then, as I took a few steps back, I heard him call out, "Hello." I turned around abruptly to find myself facing the muzzle of a gun pointed directly at me. The smile on his face had turned into a sinister expression, and he pointed the gun at me with clear intent. "Why are you in such a hurry?" he asked, my voice cracking with fear. I quickly raised my hand to show him that I wasn't resisting and asked him what he wanted. "Give me your watch, your wallet, and your cell phone," he replied coldly. I didn't waste any time and gave him everything he asked for without hesitation. I thought that once he had what he wanted, he would let me leave, but he nodded to take me away from the place. He didn't push me into the shop as I expected, but made me walk with him back into the woods. At that moment, a sense of dread was growing inside me. I was sure that if he only wanted to rob me, he would have let me go, but now he was leading me into the woods, which made me certain that he had another intention. As I walked towards the woods, I asked him why he was taking me there, but he only replied, "Walk." My voice choked with fear. I begged him to let me go. I offered to take my car if he wanted, but he didn't answer me. When we reached a far place in the woods, he asked me to stop and turn my body towards him. I did as he asked, and I was only 2 meters away from him, facing the gun pointed at my face. I knew at that moment that this was my end. My thoughts were on my mind. How would my parents feel when they heard the news? I felt tears streaming down my face, my body shaking uncontrollably. Then he said, "Kneel down." Without hesitation, I knelt on the ground, as if I was preparing to meet death. I closed my eyes, trying to count the remaining moments, waiting for the shot. Then, suddenly, I heard 3 loud noises. Bang, bang, bang. The shots echoed in my ears as I screamed and covered my ears with my hands. I fell on my face, and I thought I was dead. But moments later, I heard him laugh. His laughter was inexplicable, as if something funny had happened to him. He said as he walked away, "Go home, and don't forget to wash your pants." Then he left, leaving me lying on the ground in a state of shock. After a few minutes, I began to feel my body in a state of disbelief. I had no wound. I was sure that he had not shot me, and although I was in a state of shock, I could not understand the feelings of terror and joy that had overwhelmed me at that moment. Fear had taken over my body, while my mind was unable to comprehend what had happened. Eventually, I was able to stand up and went to my car. But before I got into the car, I returned to the building and washed my face in the bathroom. I looked in the mirror and noticed that I was in a miserable state. My face was swollen and red. I felt grateful to be alive, but I also felt extremely humiliated. My body was still shaking, and I could not shake the impact of the incident. Then I left the station and went to the neighboring city, where I borrowed a phone and called the police. I told the officers what had happened and described it to them in all its details. That night, I rented a room in a hotel while I gathered my strength after that shock. The next day, I felt a little better and continued my journey, but I will never forget those terrifying moments I went through in that dark station. Hello, my name is Emmanuel, and I have been driving trucks for more than 25 years. The story I'm going to tell you today happened about 4 years ago, and it has left a deep mark on my life, one that I will never be able to forget. That night, the sky was overcast, and the wind was blowing through the trees in the forest on both sides of the road. I was driving my big truck on the highway in northern Italy at 4 in the morning, and the road was almost deserted, as is usually the case at this time of night. I was on my way to Turin, where I had to deliver a shipment of industrial equipment, and I had 4 hours to reach my destination. At that moment, it started to rain heavily, as if the sky had suddenly opened its doors. Although I was used to driving in such conditions, The heavy rain and the fog that had begun to creep over the road made visibility almost zero. Nevertheless, I continued driving at a steady pace, believing that I would arrive on time despite the circumstances. But the heavy rain was not the only reason that made me feel uncomfortable that night. As I entered this deserted stretch of road, a strange feeling began to creep over me. I couldn't quite describe it, but it was like an inner unease that was pulling at me and making me feel uncomfortable. This wasn't a new feeling for me. I was used to feeling tired and exhausted after long hours of driving, but this time there was something unfamiliar in the air, something I couldn't explain. There was an eerie silence, as if the entire road was waiting for something. I tried to push these thoughts aside by turning on the radio. Putting on the music helped me a little to distract my mind, but the anxiety remained in my heart. I slowed down a little in an attempt to balance driving in the poor visibility. The rain was making the road slippery, and it was always wise to take extra precautions in such conditions. However, after a short distance, something happened that I never expected. The fog had thickened very much, while the rain was falling rapidly, making it difficult for anyone to drive safely. As I watched the road ahead, I noticed a strange light in the distance. It was a car driving at a very high speed, approaching me directly. With the heavy fog, I couldn't see the car clearly until it got too close to me, as if it was going to hit my truck. At the last moment, my hands moved to the steering wheel, and without thinking, I tried to avoid the oncoming car, but the slippery road made it impossible. I pulled the reins out of control, and I lost my balance in the truck. I tried hard to control the situation, but in the end, everything exploded and the truck flipped on its side and started rolling off the road. The last thing I remember is the feeling of emptiness as I separated from the ground in the rotation of the truck, and then the loud crash that filled my ears. When I woke up, I found myself lying on the cold ground, and everything around me was blurry. I felt a sharp pain in my head, and my whole body felt heavy like a mountain. I tried to move, but I couldn't. I couldn't even move my legs, and I immediately realized that I was severely injured. I was in shock, replaying the moments of the accident in my mind. The car, the collision, the rollover, everything was clearly in my mind. But now I was trapped in a dark, unfamiliar place, unable to move. My voice was so weak, I could barely utter a word. I tried repeatedly to scream for help, but to no avail. As I lay there, I felt something approaching me. Footsteps, then a car engine. Moments later, an old man and a young man appeared. They were actually father and son. They quickly approached me, took care of me, and then called an ambulance. I was fully aware that I was on the verge of death, but the hope of survival was still deep inside me. Moments later, the ambulance arrived, and I was rushed to the hospital. On the way, I was losing consciousness in and out. At the hospital, the doctors told me that I had suffered several broken bones, severe internal bleeding, and that I had suffered serious head injuries. They told me that I was lucky to be alive. At first, I didn't believe them. The accident was so devastating that I wasn't sure I would be able to recover from it. The weeks following the accident were very difficult. I was stuck in the hospital, unable to move, completely dependent on the nurses and doctors. At that moment, I felt very helpless, as if I had lost a big part of myself. But what was even stranger were the things that started happening around me. Many nights, I would feel something strange watching me. At first, I thought it was because of my head injury, but as time went on, I started seeing someone standing at the foot of my bed. He was a tall, dark-skinned man, but his features were completely blurred. He stood there still, and then he started to approach me little by little. I tried to scream, but my voice was not heard. I was in a state of extreme panic. and I closed my eyes tightly as he stood next to me, very close. I felt his cold breath on my face, and at that moment, I couldn't take it anymore. I was clinging to a small hope, trying to hold on, when I suddenly opened my eyes. He was gone. I tried to talk to the nurses in the morning, but they assured me that it was just a sleep ghost, a common condition after a brain injury. However, I was never convinced. I was certain that what I saw was real, not just a hallucination. From that day on, I began to see him again and again. At night, during the day, wherever I was, he would approach me, watching me mercilessly. This experience terrified me every time I saw him, but I could never talk about it again. I decided to search the internet for any information that might explain what was happening to me. By chance, I discovered that many horrific accidents had occurred on the same part of the road where I had the accident. Many of the victims had witnessed similar strange events. Some reported seeing car lights. Others claimed to have seen a strange object in the middle of the road. While investigating this matter, I discovered an amazing fact. The object I saw in the hospital was the spirit of a driver who had died in an accident years ago, right on this part of the road. A car had collided with his truck, and both had died. I still remember trying to understand why I had gone through what I had been through, and when I called my co-pilot, William, he told me that he had not seen another car at the time. At that moment, I understood that I was not the only one who had suffered this strange experience, and that this creature was part of the accident that had almost killed me. My name is Elon, and everything I'm about to tell you happened in August of 2008. I remember that day as vividly as if it were yesterday. It was one of the hottest summers of the year, and the heat was stifling even in the evening hours. I was behind the wheel of my old truck, heading to a construction site in the south of France with a load of steel sheets. By that point, I had been driving trucks for over 20 years, and I thought I'd seen and been through it all. But what happened that day still haunts me to this day. I was driving on Highway 60, passing through the Mont Blanc National Forest, a beautiful place during the day, but a lonely and scary place at night. I was on a very good road and was planning to stop at a truck stop near Nice to use the bathroom and grab a quick bite to eat before continuing my journey. But a few miles from the stop, I saw an old truck parked on the side of the road, its hood up. As I got closer, a stocky man started waving at me. We truckers have an unwritten rule. We always help each other out. So I slowed down, parked the truck a little further away, and got out to see what was going on. The man, who looked to be in his 40s, was wearing a grease-covered baseball cap and a flannel shirt that had once been white but was now covered in stains. His face and hands were caked with grease, showing that he had been working on his truck for a long time. The sun was setting as I approached him, and it was getting darker and darker, the sky streaking with gold and orange. "Thank God you stopped," the man said, clearly relieved. He shook my hand and told me his name was Neil. He said he had been stranded for 4 or 5 hours because his truck's alternator had failed. He asked if I could help him and take him to the nearest town where he could spend the night and find a mechanic in the morning. I hesitated for a moment, watching him carefully. He seemed harmless, and I didn't want to leave him in that state. The next town was only 20 miles away, so I decided to help him. Neil took his small bag from his truck and climbed into the passenger seat. He was a very talkative guy and told me he was from Marseille and was on his way to Paris to pick up a load. He talked about his old truck that had been breaking down quite a bit in recent weeks, but he thought it would last longer. After about 15 or 20 minutes of driving, I noticed something strange in my rearview mirror. There were 2 cars following us closely, one after the other. At first, I didn't think anything was wrong, but as time went on, I started to feel uneasy. The cars didn't try to pass him, which was odd since we were the only vehicles on the road. Concerned, I asked Neil if he knew the drivers. He looked back and said he had never seen them before. "Are you running from someone?" I joked. Neil laughed nervously, but his voice was shaking a little, which made me feel something was off. He was clearly nervous, which made me nervous too. The two cars followed us for about 10 minutes without trying to pass. Finally, when we reached a tree-lined road, the two cars accelerated suddenly, past us, and then stopped in front of us, blocking the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. 3 armed men got out of the cars and approached my truck. Neil's face turned pale, and he began to sweat profusely. I whispered to him to stay calm and reached under the seat to look for my gun. But then I remembered that I had left it at home, as my company had recently imposed a ban on carrying firearms. The men ordered us out of the truck, their guns pointed at us. I raised my hands in surrender and assured them that we were ready to surrender everything. They took us off the road and ordered us to empty our pockets. We handed them our wallets, phones, and truck keys. To my surprise, after they took our luggage, they threw me the truck keys and ordered me to drive. They told Neil to get into one of their cars and told me to follow them. They led us down a narrow dirt road, which led us deep into the woods. My mind was racing, looking for any way to escape, but there was none. After about 20 minutes, we arrived at a remote area where they stopped us in front of an abandoned cabin. Inside the cabin, they handcuffed us and told us not to call the police, then left us alone. As soon as they walked away, I began trying to free my hands from the ropes. After what seemed like a long time, I finally managed to get myself free, and then I began to untie Neil. We stumbled out of the cabin, terrified, into the dark woods. With no direction to go, we decided to walk away from the cabin, hoping to find a way. After a long while, we finally emerged onto the highway. Fearing the men would return, we hid by the side of the road, ready to hide at any moment if they approached. After what seemed like hours, an old car pulled up with an elderly man driving it. We stopped the car and explained to him what had happened. He agreed to take us to the nearest police station. At the police station, we recounted our ordeal. The sheriff assured us that he would do everything in his power to catch these men. A while later, they found my truck abandoned, but intact. Despite the shock and emotional upheaval, Neil and I were relieved to be alive. We said our goodbyes at the truck stop, exchanged phone numbers, and promised to stay in touch, even though that never happened. To this day, I think of Neil whenever I drive my truck through the south of France. That night changed something in me forever. I am much more cautious now, and I am always aware of the dangers that may lie on the road. Life goes on, and so do I. After all, the road is my second home, and there is always another destination waiting for me. My name is Jacob, and the story I'm going to tell you happened one night when I had the scariest experience of my life. I was working nights in the Netherlands, in a very remote area, in an old farm that had been converted into a small hotel. This place was my favorite job, and in fact I would say it was the easiest job I have ever had. However, there was one downside. I had to drive an hour and a half every night to get home. It was very tiring. At first I hated this late departure because it took away a lot of my personal time, but over time I got used to it. One night, while driving home, I stopped by a food truck that was parked almost in the middle of the road. I suddenly felt very hungry and couldn't wait to get home. The truck was parked outside a small car park, and I assumed that the owner either sleeps there or drives by every night to sell his food. The truck was old but had been operating in this location for about 2 months, and I had passed it several times before but never stopped. The reason was simply that I was always in a hurry because of the long distance I had to travel. But that night, hunger was driving me to stop. My stomach was about to explode with hunger, so when I saw the truck a few meters away, I veered off the road toward the entrance to the small vehicle area. I got out of my car and headed toward the truck. As I approached, I was surprised to find that this man was making the most delicious tacos I had ever tasted in my life. I asked him to make me some, and when I ate them in my car, I realized that these tacos were amazing. Maybe because I was hungry, or maybe because they actually tasted amazing. After that night, I returned home feeling like I had discovered a food treasure. So, the next night I decided to repeat the experience, and so did the night after that. I continued to stop at that truck for the next few weeks. I can't say that I stopped every day, but I can say that it became part of my regular routine on the way home from work. At first I would eat in my car like the first time, but over time I would stand by the truck, enjoy the various sauces the man offered, and pass the time with a soda and a cigarette. The man would also offer me lemon-scented handkerchiefs, which I loved, and I always saved them for my trip home. Over the next few months, I stopped by the truck about 40 or 50 times. Although I stopped regularly and started conversations with him almost daily, I never learned his name. I didn't ask him at first, and then I never asked him again. It wasn't necessary. He didn't ask my name either, and our relationship remained as superficial as it was. Now that I think about it, I realize that I was probably a bit rude. But in the end, it didn't affect him. I was just one of the regulars who stopped by on a daily basis. But now, after everything that happened, I wish I had asked him his name, because there came a day when it became very important. It might have had to do with life or death. And unfortunately, I did not know it. When I stopped at the usual place one night, there was no one in the truck. Everything seemed normal at first, but when I approached the truck, I noticed that the man was not there, and there were no customers either. Apparently, I was the only one at that moment. I thought to myself, strange, but he was probably picking up something from inside the truck. I waited for a few minutes, but the man did not appear. I thought that he was probably riding or preparing something behind the truck. But as time passed, I began to worry. There was no sound in the place, no movement on the road or in the surrounding area. Everything was unusually quiet. While I was standing, I began to smell something burning. I got closer to the truck, and when I looked at the grill, I realized that something was burning on it. I shouted, "Hey, something is burning here," but there was no response. The truck was tightly closed, and the silence was eerie. It was a large, well-equipped truck, and I could barely see the grill. But I didn't have time to explore further, because I was worried that this fire could cause a disaster. I realized that I had to move quickly. If the fire continued, the truck could be destroyed, or worse, the kitchen could catch fire. It was hard to believe that this was happening, but all I could think about was protecting his hard-working place. So I decided to go inside the truck and put out the grill myself. As I got inside the truck, the first thing I noticed was the open cash box on the table with coins scattered around it. I felt something strange in the air, as if something was wrong. I initially thought it was a robbery, but there were no signs of any struggle or chaos. It wasn't what I expected, but I couldn't think of anything else. As I was thinking about what to do, I approached the grill to put it out. When I looked at it, I almost exploded with shock. What was burning on the grill was not food, but a person's hand, completely burned, and it was clearly and terrifyingly shaped on the grill. The sight terrified me, and I almost fell from shock, but I managed to maintain my balance, and then I did what I could to quickly extinguish the flames. After that, I quickly closed the door and ran to my car to call the police. At first, I didn't know what to say. I thought there had been a robbery and someone had been injured, but I didn't know who it was or where he had gone after the incident. I continued to file a police report, and they explained to me that they would send agents to investigate. I waited for about an hour, but no one showed up. In the end, I decided to go home. I still felt guilty that I couldn't help more, and that I couldn't find out what had happened to this strange man. It all happened 6 years ago, in June 2018. That's when I decided to go on an impromptu solo day trip. I always enjoy exploring new places and seeing the sights, and there were a few nearby spots that I had been wanting to visit before I went back to college in August. It was the perfect time to take this short trip. My plan was pretty simple. Wake up early the next morning, then start the road trip, visit a few different sites throughout the day, and finally start heading back home around 9 p.m. I figured this would allow me to maximize my time on the trip without having to pay for a hotel, which would help me save some money at the same time. The first part of the trip was fine. I didn't have any problems. However, when it came time to head back, things were completely different. I had left the place around 10 p.m. According to Apple Maps, I estimated that it would take me about 4.5 hours to get home. I was about halfway there when I started to feel very tired. I tried to stay awake by washing my face with water from the water bottle I had brought with me, but my attempts were in vain. After a while, driving became unsafe. I decided that at the next stop I saw on the road, I would stop and take a nap for an hour so that I could continue driving safely. I could make it home in good time if I did that. So, I stopped at a rest stop that I came across a few miles later. What immediately caught my attention was the lack of cars in the parking lot. The place was almost empty, and if it weren't for the dim lights that were on in some places, I would have thought the station was deserted. But I quickly realized that it was very late, and it made sense that the station would be empty at that late hour of the night. I lay in my car seat and set my alarm to wake me up in an hour. When the alarm went off, I realized that I needed to go to the building because I urgently needed to use the bathroom. I started walking towards the building, and when I entered, I went straight to the bathroom and opened one of the doors. I had only been in the bathroom for about 30 seconds when I suddenly heard someone talking in the hallway outside the bathroom. It was very surprising to me, as I hadn't heard the front door of the building open, and my car was the only one parked in the parking lot just a minute earlier. I couldn't figure out how someone else could be here so quickly. Then, the bathroom door suddenly opened, and I was nervous. But I thought to myself that it was probably just another normal person I hadn't noticed, so I didn't think much of it. I was about to leave when I heard a soft knock on the cubicle door. I felt embarrassed and said, "Is there someone there?" But there was no response, and silence was the answer. This made me feel even more anxious, so I decided to stay in the cubicle until the person left. At that moment, I noticed an eye watching me through the crack in the cubicle door. When we met eyes, the man started screaming and banging his head frantically on the door. "What is this?" I whispered in a low voice, and I began to feel very anxious and scared. In a moment of quick thinking, I used all my strength to pull my body towards the door to prevent it from crashing. But when I saw that the man wouldn't stop hitting and screaming, I opened the door forcefully and pushed him away from me, then ran as fast as I could towards my car. I was halfway to the parking lot when I heard the front door open behind me. I quickly turned around and found the man chasing me. Luckily, I was much faster than him, and I finally reached my car. I quickly got into the car and started to reverse. But the man caught up with me and managed to slam his body into my car door. As I accelerated, I looked in the rearview mirror, and as I pulled away from the station, I saw the man standing there, ready to get up as if nothing had happened. That scene was absolutely shocking. I couldn't believe what had just happened. To tell the truth, I didn't know how to deal with the situation. You always hear stories like this, but you never imagine that this would happen to you. When I left the station, I was in such a state of panic that I probably exceeded the speed limit on some parts of the road on the way home. It's no surprise that I couldn't sleep after this incident, as my body was filled with adrenaline after the encounter with this strange creature. To this day, I don't know who this man was, where he came from, or what exactly his problem was. If I had to guess, I'd guess that he was probably a homeless person in an unstable state of mind. But the question I still have is, how did this person get there? Why was he standing almost in the middle of the highway? All I know is that since this incident, I haven't stopped at any rest stops, and I intend to stay that way for the rest of my life if possible. To start it up and started backing out. But the guy caught up to me and managed to slam his body into my door. As I accelerated, I looked in my rearview mirror, and as I drove away, I saw the guy get up like it was nothing and just stood there looking in my direction. I was beyond shocked. I couldn't process what had just happened. Honestly, I didn't know what to think. You always hear crazy stories like this, but you never think it will actually happen to you. When I left the rest stop, I was so freaked out that I was probably over the speed limit for a few miles and the rest of the way home. I guess it goes without saying that I wouldn't fall asleep by any means, as my body was pumped with adrenaline after my close encounter of the third kind with this being from hell. I still have no idea who he was, where he was from, or what his damn problem was. If I had to guess, I'd say he was probably a homeless guy who just wasn't right in the head. But then again, why would a homeless person be practically in the middle of nowhere on the side of the freeway? It doesn't make sense. How did he get there? All I know is that I've never stopped at a rest stop since, and I plan to keep it that way for the rest of my life if possible.